the entire cosmos is the graven image.
What does that mean?
So the graven image is that statue that people are worshiping, and so taking that even further to the idea of this universe, or this plane of separation, if you will, is all in its totality a veil between you and Creator, which is, it's worth sitting with for a while.
Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Bob Peck, who is author of the book Original Sin is a Lie. And I first heard Bob on Aubrey Marcus Podcast a few weeks ago and immediately felt some deep truth in the things that he was sharing about his understanding of the Bible. And as someone who's really well studied, not just in Christianity, but religions across the board and the spiritual teachings that are really infused within them, the purpose of the book is to demystify or kind of separate the spiritual teachings from the dogma and the doctrine. Now, full disclosure, I thought Bob was coming on the podcast 2 weeks from the day that we recorded. That morning, I was downloading the audiobook, and then I thought, let me check when he's on. And I looked when I thought he was, and it wasn't then. And I looked the week before, and it wasn't then. And it actually turned out to be the day I was checking. So first time I've made that mistake, and I started listening to the audiobook. I'm 3.5 hours in, but I haven't actually completed it. And I do share this with Bob as well. So my mistake. But what I can say is this. From what I've heard so far, the book really is incredible. It's so obvious to me that Bob has a really deep connection to the spiritual truths across the board in religions and spiritual teachings. And he does an amazing job of pointing out the crossover and where different teachings show up. And also to kind of highlight the fact that some of the Bible is written by man and there are things that are incongruent. And he further points to what were the spiritual teachings that are actually applicable within it. So I really enjoy this episode. Bob is really a fountain of knowledge and has been deeply in the study of spiritual teachings for many years. And we agreed that once I actually finish the book, we're going to get him back on for round 2. The last thing from me, if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and maybe leave a comment to let me know what you thought of this episode. All right. Thank you so much for watching. Let's get into it. Bob, welcome to the Lost and Found podcast. I'm really excited to have you here, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sabri. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so full disclosure, kind of funny story. This morning I was downloading the audiobook Original Sin is a Lie, which is your new book. And I first came across you on Aubrey's podcast a few weeks ago. And as I was listening to it, I felt so much resonance with things that I've kind of felt to be true around some of the things that you were saying. I knew immediately, like, want to have a conversation. And I was coming to download the audiobook this morning. I had it in my head that we were doing this podcast on the 22nd of August for some reason. And I went through to the 22nd on my calendar and I thought, it's not there. I was like, is it the week before? So I had a look and it wasn't there. And then I was like, well,
it's today.
And it was today. I was like, oh no. So I'm 3.5 hours in to the audiobook.
Well, we'll do a part 2 after you're finished.
Yeah, that would be great. But what's really interesting is so far, and I genuinely mean this, it would be a book that I would absolutely recommend to people that I know that are venturing down a spiritual path and want to get some light shone on the whole picture. And it feels a little bit like, are you familiar with Ken Wilber?
Love Ken.
Yeah. So, what he does with integral theory and taking part of this and part of that, it kind of feels somewhat similar to what you're doing with the religions, and you're pointing out, here's how this crosses over with this and with this and with this. And you see the kind of the truths that are woven in between the different lineages, the different traditions. And I think what's really interesting, and I'll share this with you more as we go on, I've had some interesting experiences where I feel like I've had things come through me that I really didn't know before, in when I've been writing at times. And some of the things that came through were really aligned with some of the things that I heard you say, which I feel like within some of the things of Christianity, there are certain parts of it that you just kind of feel in your body to be true. Like you feel the truth. And then there are other parts where it's like, I don't feel it. I don't feel that.
That's a very beautiful kind of jumping off point, because I do firmly believe in the power of kind of what's been called the intuitive knowing, or, it's really that inner compass, right, that every human being has. And Ram Dass, who I write about, is a big hero of mine, and so many, talks a lot about the rational and the intuitive, kind of harmonizing those two. I think in contemporary civilization, we worship the rational mind, and it's great. Don't get me wrong. It's created, these devices that we're communicating on. There's a lot of value that the rational mind has. The problem is when it's the only voice in the conversation, or, in the civilization in this case. And so kind of letting the rational mind just share that cohesive, harmonious existence with the intuitive mind, I think is really the beauty of the spiritual path, because you still need the rational mind. You don't want to be just flailing arms, mystic throughout the cosmos, or at least that's not my style. But yeah, I like that point in terms of looking at these texts, right? Looking at the Bible, looking at these scriptures, and saying, "Hey, this resonates, this doesn't." And that's really what you're describing, Sabri, is the first, probably 1/3. You said you're about 3 hours into the 9-hour audiobook, so that really is the initial kind of act, if you will, is about Bible scholarship, and really saying, what's Jesus's real true teaching, what's
Mhm.
his authentic original teaching. And I'm using scholars, I'm using the mystics, basically. I'm using kind of, again, rational intuitive. Maybe that's the theme of today. I'm using both of those lenses to try to understand this, because really, step one in looking at Christianity and the Bible is, in terms, in my view, of really, before you can jump in and really appreciate it, you have to say, hey, the Bible is not infallible. That's really step one. And it's not this big conspiracy to suggest that. We have all of these different discrepancies, we have all of these different contradictions. Some are more significant than others, some are subtler. But the work, really, the last 150 years, um, in the world of academia, in Bible scholarship, they really have analyzed the heck out of these things. And we have, one thing I talk a lot about is the kind of difference in, for example, the Jesus character in each gospel. And when I say Jesus character, I'm not implying that Jesus was not a real person. I firmly believe that. In fact, it's extremely historically likely that he walked the earth as a man from Nazareth. But the the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke, Gospel of John, the character in each of those Gospels is very different. And that's looking at the text, looking at these kind of very deep rhetorical analyses. So that's kind of the context for a very big chapter at the top called "Why It's Okay to Pick and Choose in the Bible." To your
Mm.
point, and that's something that ruffles some Christians' feathers. And I'm not trying to be antagonistic. And frankly, I think Christianity is a valid path to God. I think all paths lead you there, um, in my own kind of universalist view. Um, but the Bible is not infallible. And once you understand that, then you can actually get closer with it. You can get more intimate with the text. You can find teachings and parts of it that really, to your point, resonate with you. And because he is worth really contemplating. I mean, we still wouldn't be talking about this guy if he wasn't worth, really enjoying.
Yeah, I've found that when I didn't grow up religious. I actually had Christian mother Muslim father.
Mm.
And my dad in his later life actually became Christian. But our parents, my brother and I, our parents kind of said, hey, one's Christian, one's Muslim. If you guys get older and you decide you want to choose a religion, you choose.
Wow,
And
that's beautiful.
that's kind of how we
We're in
were.
love and we see things differently in some ways, but it's all one anyway. And yeah, that's
And,
great.
and that's kind of how, we were raised. My dad wasn't a practicing Muslim, although many of his brothers were. They did
Mm.
the pilgrimage to Mecca, and
Mm-hmm.
so one half of my family is Muslim, and my mum, I would say, she is not a church going Christian, but she has her own individual, belief and faith in Jesus. But for me, actually, I kind of grew up, I would have considered myself an atheist. And with that being said, I was, I started listening to Wayne Dyer when I was 14.
Oh, wow, that's
And
great.
I'd read the Tao of Jeet Kune Do by Bruce Lee when I was 13, which was because I was practicing martial arts, but also there's a lot of philosophy in there. And then I kind of got on that path from that age. And the further I went down the path of like kind of what felt like self-development, eventually I found myself in this place of spirituality. And then my path led me to
You
some.
looked up all of a sudden, you're like, wait a second. Here I am down the rabbit hole.
Yeah,
Oh
exactly,
boy.
yeah. And that led me to, ayahuasca, which then when I did that about 7 years ago, that changed a lot for me. That kind of became part of my journey. And then it was November 2020 where I was out walking one day. I'd fasted for 24 hours and I was walking for about 10 kilometers, about 7 miles or
Oh
so.
wow. Yeah.
And I came home and I ended up meditating for maybe an hour. And then I felt the need to start writing. And I started to write, and I felt like I was writing things that just absolutely weren't my thoughts, things that I'd never thought before. And a lot of it was like, it was biblical. It was around biblical teachings, but it was pointing to the deeper spiritual truth of what gets missed. And I would say that some of the things now, looking into more of like Gnosticism, there was things that were more akin to like some Gnostic. It was like more, spiritual, maybe mystical. And it was wild because it wasn't just that, it actually changed my entire view of what I was. And like the following day, literally some areas of my life completely changed. It felt akin to an ayahuasca journey, to how I felt different after. So that kind of blew my head off. I then started going, okay, I want to look into some of the things that Jesus said more. And I could maybe hear one line and then I'd have to pause and I'd think about it, just sit with it and be like, I think there's a way deeper meaning to those words than what most people would ever hear. And where I got to, and I wanted to share this with you, and for me, this is fun because this can be like a playground to explore these ideas, is that paradigmatically, it feels like he was in such a different place or level of consciousness that even when he says the word I believe he's saying something completely different to how most people would use I. So, as an example, when he said, I am the way, the truth, the life, some people from a paradigm would be like, oh, like this egoic person who thinks he's the only. And for me, it was like, no, I think he's almost the disillusion of ego and the idea of me and myself, and actually identifies as that capital I, which is the same as the Roman numeral one, like the oneness that we are, and the recognition that this being here is like, I'm not me, I am I. And what came up for me was that if you replaced I am with I is, it would almost make, I might land a bit easier. So
Mm,
capital I is the way,
mm.
capital I is the truth. Like that I, that oneness is what we are. And so that was one of the things that came
That's
up.
really
And then,
nice.
yeah.
Beautifully put. Yeah. So John 14:6 is the line that you're referencing, and Happy to go into detail about it because, and you mentioned the Aubrey Marcus podcast, which was a real treat to go on. I kind of had a lot more eyeballs on my work after that. And I've had some Christians that are not crazy about my work and my book, and that's okay. It's some of those guys, I don't know them obviously, but when people are angry at human beings that they don't know, they're coming from a place of fear. They're probably dealing with some suffering themselves. So it's been an interesting part of my practice just to kind of transmute my reaction and say, okay, if these guys are going to be upset, then you know I'm getting ad hominem attacks and things like that. It's like, it doesn't matter to me. Like I'm very firmly rooted in my own uh, belief system and my relationship with this material, my experiences, and so on. And I'm doing it from a place of love. I'm not doing it really from anything else. I'm not trying to start a cult or anything. I'm just trying to share some ideas from my studies and experiences. But that said, John 14:6 gets commented pretty much every day, Sabri. It's like my joke is like, it's a daily, here's my daily John 14:6. And it's because of exactly what you were describing, the narrowness of the exclusivist Christian to say, well, Jesus said he's the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. So there you have it. It's kind of like, it's very like professorial kind of, oh, he must not know this verse. I'm happy to point out to him. And so a couple of things about that verse. First off, it's in the Gospel of John, which from a Bible scholarship standpoint, which I have a bachelor's degree in comparative religion with a specialty on formative Christianity. I'm not a Bible scholar. That would be like a graduate degree or master's or a PhD. But I do say I'm a student of Bible scholarship. I'm okay with that title. So Bible scholars understand that Mark was very, very likely the first gospel. We even have the timeline in which it was written around 70 CE to 75. Matthew is the next one in 70 to 80 CE. Luke is 75 to 85, 90 CE. John is very clearly at the earliest 100 CE, could be as late as 125 CE. And Jesus is killed in 30 to 35 CE. So, but essentially, as I was alluding to earlier, the Jesus character evolves in the formation of the Gospels. In Mark, the earliest Gospel, he even has a failed miracle. He's not everyone understands him. He's kind of this wandering desert wizard, as he's been described in Mark. And he gets run out of Nazareth. I mean, it's not everything is amazing in Mark. Matthew, just kind of a little quick explanation here of each one. Matthew is very clearly written in Galilee, which is the Jewish homeland. So it's the Matthean Jesus is very Jewish. He's very concerned with the prophets, the law, what's to come, the rules and regulations, and so on. Luke's Jesus, not as Jewish. The Lucan Gospel and Luke Acts, those two, were written outside of the Jewish homeland. The Jesus in Luke is more concerned about preaching to Gentiles. He talks a lot about money and the poor and so on. That's really the focus of Luke. And then John is actually called the spiritual gospel. So there's an Orthodox bishop named Clement of Alexandria. Clement, who was very, very early, and he was an Orthodox bishop, is the first one to say, John's the spiritual gospel. It's kind of like a nice way of saying, like, we know it's not very historical, but it's poetic, and it has some zingers, don't throw it out, but it's not as historically reliable. It's clearly later. That's clearly, it doesn't have the birth narrative. For example, it starts with, in the beginning was the word. It's just very poetic, very mystical aspect. So I'm the way, the truth, and life is in that one, first off. Secondarily, there's something that I do talk about in the book as well, which is the idea of the audience pertaining to the meaning. So, he's Jesus is basically traveling around. He is speaking to, you could really say three different audiences. He's speaking to very large groups, Sermon on the Mount. He's speaking to smaller groups in kind of more intimate settings, and then he's speaking just to the disciples. Those are kind of the three main environments. And so, really understanding which environment is going to help impact the meaning of the teaching. Because if he's speaking to the larger crowds, he's going to say, pray to your Father in heaven, blessed are the poor, simple, direct teachings, right? Smaller groups, he talks about how the parables that are teaching devices, those are actually for, people who don't know him in a sense because they are almost disguising some of what he has to say. Like you alluded to, like the paradigm in which he was, like some of the stuff that he was saying was blasphemous, in a sense. And so he had to be careful around, hey, I'll tell it as a parable. It'll be a little story. The Good Samaritan, for example, is a radical story. It's beautiful, but it's kind of masked in this figurative language. And then the disciples, the close disciples, it's very clear, and I'm starting to kind of cite, other mystics who kind of studied this. But, you know what? Actually, let me find you. There is a quote even from, this is from Mark 4:10. It says, when he was alone, those who were around him with the 12 asked him about the parables. He said to them, to you is given the mystery of God's kingdom, but to those who are outside, all things are done in parables. That's Mark 4:10 and 11. So Jesus himself in the gospel says this, that there's kind of a different meaning based on the different context of the audience. So all that said, the close disciples get the true identity. They're the ones that have been living with the master. They understand spiritual language a lot more deeply than these crowds or these groups that he's kind of traveling through. And so the I Am the Way, the Truth segment is only to the very, very close disciples. It's not this big pronouncement to the large sermons and the large crowds, which I think further validates your interpretation and my interpretation and the mystics' interpretation of saying, this is symbolic. I am the way means my way. It means I have attained this level of unconditional love, of pure vesselhood, of undoing the ego, of seeing the one in all things. And that is the only way. But no one gets to the Father except through me. You can't know God until you've undone the ego, until no one gets to the Father except through me. You have to embrace this level of unconditional love in order to see the Creator. And right before, the last thing I'll say about this is right before that segment, to kind of validate this interpretation as well, is the line, before Abraham was, I am. Right? And so Abraham is the founder of the Jewish religion. He's 1,000+ years before Jesus, the man. So when he's in that space of saying, before Abraham was, I am. He's not talking about this body that's impossible. He's saying that quality of unconditional love that, sometimes the mystics or the New Age crowd says Christ consciousness. It's like he's attained that level of consciousness. And so I'm happy to clarify that one. And I'm so glad you brought it up as like kind of the first verse in great detail, because Christians love it and they think that it justifies, this kind of single pathway to God. And I don't see it like that either.
Just a quick one from me. I hope you're really enjoying this episode. And if you like these types of conversations and you want to take part in them yourself, I host a call every Thursday called Finding Freedom. And it's a call of self-exploration. We do guided meditation, some contemplation, and then share conversation with the group. So if you'd like to find a tribe of like-minded people and you want to come and join, find the link in the description below. It's completely for free, and we would love to see you there. All right, that's it. Let's get back into it. Yeah, for me, it kind of, I resonate with what Eckhart Tolle says, which is the I is like the witnessing presence above the self. And if there's I and myself, and that
Right.
it feels like that is the oneness that we all are. And I sometimes think about little I've mentioned this before on the podcast. I had the first time I mentioned it, I had Dr. Mark Gaffney on. And him and I I was over in Vermont with him a few weeks ago, and we've been forming a relationship, which is really beautiful.
Great.
And as he talks about the idea of separate self and true self and unique self, and I was thinking about this idea of what am I? And I thought, well, as soon as I use a word after am, I feel like it's kind of reductionist. It reduces what I am by trying to use the word. And then I thought, well, maybe I finish at I am. And then I thought, am is remarkably similar to om. And if we say in the beginning that
nice.
there was the word, if that word was om, the essence of absolute supreme consciousness, then I om, would that be closer to the idea of like trying to explain what I am? And then to loop it into Mark's teachings of unique self, I am Sabri is almost the recognition of me being the essence of supreme absolute consciousness, which is the recognition of the connectedness to all. But then the Sabri bit is the uniqueness that uniquely kind of expressed as me, and just playing around with that idea.
For a few blinks of an eye. Yeah, that's really great, and I'm glad you called that out. And I love that line. The Eckhart line is, I think that was his suicidal kind of awakening thought, right? Which was, I can't live with myself. And he said, wait a second, there's two me. There's two different vantage points. That's great. And thanks for reminding me of that. It's very right in line with Eastern philosophy, right? And the mystics as well. I know Reverend Gaffney is a Jewish mystic, but the mystics, labeling the mystics is a bit silly sometimes because they just melt away all the boundaries. But yeah, in terms of the mystics and kind of the Eastern philosophy, I'm a huge fan of Yogananda. I write about him a lot in the book as well, and Sri Ramana Maharshi. All those masters in the Hindu philosophy world. Well, I outed myself. I have some smiling faces around me, and Yogananda puts it real nice. He says, "We've all been rich, we've all been poor, we've all been fat, we've all been skinny, we've all been ugly, we've all been beautiful, we've all been famous, we've all been unknowns. Don't get caught. Don't get caught in the role. Play the part. You're here to play this part beautifully and hit your marks and come out. All the world's a stage. The Shakespeare. All the men are merely actors. It's you're still in the drama, right? But I think, especially in the West, in a kind of American late stage cap over here, we are very we are this. I am my body. I am my job. Even worse. And so it's it's refreshing as hell to have the mystics and the yogis and monks from all these different traditions and nuns remind us that it's just, this is the passing show. This is the transitory character. This is the persona, the role that you're playing, not in a dismissive way either necessarily. Which I think it's okay to revere that, like you're saying, in kind of the fractal of the one. We're all fractals of the one. I think I'm not saying we're not it either. It's just a part of it.
Yeah, it almost comes back to the Ken Wilber bit of true but partial. It's
Mm,
yes, and it's almost like I feel that things are true within a paradigm. So, for example, story is important, and it's important within the paradigm of the story of who I am. But then above the story of who I am is the this I. It's this kind of like we could say higher self, and I
yeah.
think that's where this true but partial becomes.
The observer. Ramana calls it the observer, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where it becomes almost important to be able to hold a lot of spiritual and mystical understandings is the true but partial.
Mm. Yeah, paradoxical nature of it all. Yeah, I'm really, lately I've been interested in, well, not lately, it's been a few years now, in the non-dual philosophies. It seems like there's a really great book called Disappearance of the Universe, by Gary Renard, which I highly recommend, which explains kind of spiritual paths and philosophical systems almost like they're on a scale from duality to pure non-duality. They say kind of duality, semi non-duality, and then pure non-duality. Non-duality just meaning not two, right? Only one, or not even only, because only implies multiple. Just one, not two. And I think there is some confusion in the application of the non-dual sometimes, in both kind of the A Course in Miracles community, which is a book that Disappearance has parallels to and kind of introduces alongside of Sri Ramana and Nisargadatta, kind of the Advaita Vedantins, um, this idea. And now it's almost in, if, you're probably familiar with like the um, Sam Harris kind of crowd talking about like, what's the term for it in contemporary psychology? That's like if there's only me. Um, Gosh, I'm drawing a blank on it, but it's a parallel to non-duality essentially, like that everything's just this creation of myself, and that is that does seem to be true. Jesus says, "If thine eye be single, your whole body will be full of light." There's all these kind of non-dual pepperings and sprinklings throughout scriptures and all of these traditions, but at the same time, have you still have your duty to live as a separate being. That's kind of what I'm working through in my own personal experience right now. It's like having this non-dual understanding of the oneness, the connectivity, and still paying taxes. You still have to lock your doors when you go to sleep, because that other part of your consciousness might be hungry and need, suffering and need to break it. It's like there's in the dream. A lot of mystics use that terminology too. In the dream of separation, right? We're these dream figures, but when you awake, it's just one of us.
And it's so interesting you say that because it was just earlier today I was talking about the idea of almost being in the dream, but sometimes we get lost in it. It's almost like
Yeah,
Inception. When you go a dream
yeah,
within a dream within a dream, you then have got lost in that one and you forgot. And I feel like that's what a lot of people have done collectively is we're almost in that Inception level where we're
mm,
like in a thought within a thought from the past. And we're often just in that, as Eckhart would say, the horizontal dimension of, past and future in thought. And we've
sure.
kind of lost the connection to a depth of what we are.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, yeah, and I think the material world is alluring.
Mm.
It's the amount of stimuli response. It's captivating as hell. It captivates me all the time, and it really does seem to be a practice of undoing, or sometimes called remembering your true identity, because gosh, it just, you get past one and it hooks you. You get past another one, you take off one hook, and then you get the Hydra, three more. So being gentle with ourselves, kind of for where we are, has been a big part of it as well.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because there's a story of King Nebuchadnezzar and the
Hmm.
worshipping the statue of gold, and really, like, we look at that story, and then we just look at life now, and the statue of gold is the car or the watch or the purse or even the Instagrammable location where you want to have a photo to say like, hey, I was in Mykonos or whatever the place, fill in the
Yeah,
blank. And actually
the perception of
it's just so wild to see how that idea of the statue of gold and worshipping that has just taken on different forms now. And it's kind of wild when you think about just, I mean, I guess really, a few thousand years in the cosmos of time is nothing really. So yeah, I guess it would
right.
make sense that we've not changed that much.
Yeah, it's still the same basic idea. Yeah, there's a really great Course in Miracles teacher that I love, David Hoffmeister. He says the entire cosmos is the graven image.
The entire cosmos is the great image. What does that mean?
So the graven image is that statue that
Hmm.
that people are worshiping, um, and so taking that even further to the idea of this universe or this plane of separation, if you will, is all in its totality a veil between you
Hmm.
and Creator, which is, yeah, it's worth sitting with for a while, because then you think, well, wait a second, it's one thing that, well, let me clarify this to say the term New Age gets a bad rap, frankly, and I wish it wasn't such a pejorative term, because I think mostly the idea around New Age is pretty cool. It's like, hey, all these different religions have validity. It's very similar to the mystic traditions. There's these parallels between, they honor, the New Age community honors indigenous folks. It honors the mystics of all past. I mean, there's a lot of beauty in what is called New Age, even though when people use that term, they're typically being insulting. And however, I will say that the one kind of uh, asterisk recently for me has been like when people say like the universe instead of God. They say, yes, if you're not comfortable with God, you can just say the universe. And for a non-dualist, that's those aren't interchangeable. The universe is actually the veil that covers up the face of God. Um, So anyway, semantic
Yeah, that makes
complaints.
sense though. And I sometimes use a little trepidation when I speak to people and use the word God. And I can sense that some
Yeah,
people know exactly what I mean. I feel like I have to clarify. I don't mean the bearded man in the sky. And I feel like I
right.
have to make
That's a
that.
useful disclaimer.
Yeah. And I think I tend to use like either like divinity or the all that
Yeah,
is.
yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, yeah. I
Um,
use creator. I have an Apache teacher, and
mm,
his word for God is creator, or sometimes he says mother, father, God, which is nice because it, to your point, kind of eliminates the patriarchal aspect. Mother, father, God. But
yeah.
even that word God, the word God is just not really that useful anymore in this century, right? Because to your point, it typically makes people go, oh, the mad guy that Michelangelo painted. No thanks.
And one of the things that I heard Mark say a couple of weeks ago, where he said, "The God you don't believe in, I don't believe in the God you don't believe in."
Right, right.
And I
That's
thought,
great.
oh yeah,
That's a
that's
great line.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I don't believe in the God you don't believe in. We both don't believe in that God.
yeah. That's
Um,
nice. I'm stealing
and
that.
yeah, and to your point about the new age, it feels like to me that there are people that are on their own individual spiritual journey, because I feel like there's a lot of people that feel there's something more, there's something beyond the veil, but almost don't trust a lot of kind of religion, and in many ways rightly so. And I think we can
Sure.
see how the baby was thrown out with the bathwater a little when it came to I don't believe in that God. So instead of, so what
It's
is
all,
God?
yeah. And I think I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that really is a big part of my work, is to say the baby's good, or it's a beautiful baby, but the
Baby's sacred.
bathwater is dirty. Let's change the bathwater. But the baby, is worth contemplating, right? The baby really, because it's like there's a reason this stuff survives. There's a really great image, and it's not in my book. I found out, I heard this later. I was kicking myself because I was like, this would have been perfect when the point I was trying to make. But now it's on podcasts, right? Brother David Steindl Rast, who's a Benedictine monk, who he says, all religions start from mysticism, but over time they lose that fervor. He says it's like a volcano when it explodes. At first, it's this sheer, unspeakable power of energy and vitality. And then he says, after a decade or a century or a millennia, that lava that was on fire now just becomes dead rock, and it's like that's true for all these different religious systems, because they, and this is, I do write about this too. The avatar doctrine is also a crucial component here, which ties into that image, which is that the idea, which comes from the Bhagavad Gita in Hinduism, just this idea that Krishna tells Arjuna. He says, when evil takes over the earth, I rise to set virtue on her seat again. When things go off, when the egos of humanity take over, a spark of divinity manifests in this profound way, either by a human attaining or a god descending. I don't know, and I don't really care, from like a theological standpoint. There's like so many arguments about, is the avatar an attainment or a descendant? It doesn't matter to me. But you have Jesus, you have Buddha, you have Krishna, you have all of these saints and sages and men and women throughout history who are in different cultures, in different periods, and they're needed exactly. They're typically reformers. Also, I draw that comparison between Jesus and Buddha. Jesus is reforming Judaism in a sense. Buddha is reforming Hinduism in a sense. I think Muhammad is reforming the Bedouin, and kind of Zoroastrian dilution in a sense. All of these greats come on the scene and they say, hey, we're getting a little wooden here. These rituals are getting a little empty. Here's how you, get reconnected with source, and so on. And so yeah, that's really kind of one of my larger points from like a comparative religious standpoint is they're all valid because they all come from a pure spark of unconditional love that a generation or two or three later is, we can see in the Gospels and we can see in the text how it changes. I mean, it's not even like a conspiracy. It's just look at the words in the copies that we have. It's there. So it's a big, I think to your original point, like the secular world that we're in, it's a real joy for me to say, well, hang on a second, guys. There's some good stuff in here, and because I get angry Christians and I get angry atheists. I mean, on my comments, mostly I get people that are like what I'm doing, but about 10% are angry Christians saying John 14:6. About 10% are angry atheists saying this is all fairy tales, And I'm going, oh, peace to both of you.
Yeah, right. It's always interesting, I find, and just in regards to the angry Christians, it's a fun story. I think it's worth sharing. I went to the cathedral near me a few months ago.
Where is that, by the way?
So I'm in a city called Derby, which is kind of right in the centre of England.
Oh, amazing.
The nearest bigger city is Nottingham, which more people will have heard of.
Familiar with Robin Hood, my hero of fables.
Yeah, exactly. Sheriff of Nottingham, yeah.
That's great.
Robin Hood, yeah. So I went to the cathedral, and I went on a Sunday. I thought, let's go check out a service. Let's go. So I went, and I'm kind of soaking it in. And there was one priest. Would it be a priest that spoke? And there was other people speaking in the service, and I just felt there's a disconnection between what they're saying, and I almost felt like they couldn't. I almost felt like they weren't seeing the deeper truth in the words. And then one spoke, and I thought, oh, he gets this.
Here we go. Yeah.
I felt like it was applied. So he was talking about Jesus going into the desert and having to, to be tempted by the devil. And he said, what I want to ask you today is, what is your desert? When do you enter the desert when you are tempted? He said, and where the devil tries to convince you. He said, for me, it's when I look in the kitchen and I see a half-empty gin bottle and I convince myself it's half full. And I just thought, so first of all, the fact that he's acknowledging that publicly to everybody.
Yeah, respect.
And he's like, actually, how do we apply this? And I thought, oh, here's someone who seems to get it. And I felt this. Now, as the service went on, there was mass and everyone went and did that. And then there was two women that were actually sat next to me. And they went and at the end just stood in the middle, and one knelt down and put a robe over herself. And I thought, this is interesting. Like, what's going on here? And I thought, this is my first time, so I'm kind of watching with curiosity. And then someone else sprinkled something over it. I thought, okay. And then they held out a banner about climate change. And I thought, oh, okay, I don't think this is part of the service. But then she goes up to the, where do people speak from? Is it a lectern? Is that the...
Yeah. Podium, yeah.
And she starts to speak. And I thought, oh, she must be a part of the service. Anyway, she definitely wasn't. She definitely wasn't. And they're trying to get her down from there. And you can start to see certain people are starting to get quite irate. And I just watched with real curiosity and really the first thing that came to me was, what would Jesus do in this scenario? Would he try to silence her, or would he want to connect? Would he want to understand? Would he want to say, hey, let's have a conversation? Tell me, because they're talking about the effects of climate change and some of the things like the ways that the church are involved in climate and how what they could be doing. And it got to the point where they were kind of being ushered, and someone from the choir came and snatched the banner away in quite an aggressive manner. And then some other guy came out, and again, quite aggressive. And these are two women that I would say maybe 60, small women. And at this point, we
don't need to get physical with them.
At this point, I thought, okay, I actually now am getting close to the point where I think I need to step in to gently say, hey, brother, these are two getting on for older women. Let's relax.
Yeah.
I almost felt a duty to kind of be just on guard a little here, because I thought,
mediator. Yeah, I like that.
Because of what they're doing, they're not. They weren't being. They were trying to make their point. Get it? Okay. We don't have to panic. Let's go speak to them.
Yeah.
And so this kind of all happened, and I ended up then speaking.
That's awfully reasonable of you, Sabri. How dare you?
So at the end, they came back in to get their things because they were next to me. And I just looked at one of them, and I just looked her right in the eyes, and I said, how are you? And she said, yeah, okay. And I said, what's your message? And she started talking about it. And actually, she seemed like someone that was very much into mysticism and the spiritual teachings of Christianity. And she was saying that how the church do this and this. And I was thinking, interesting. So they go outside, and some other people went out. And again, I almost felt like I had to just follow to be maybe a little bit of a mediator in case it was necessary, because some people were being a little, felt a little too aggressive, not very Jesus-like in that scenario. And so one woman came out from the choir, and I'm talking to there was a chap that was there, a guy that was recording, older fella, and I spoke to him, and he said he considers himself a Christian Buddhist. That's what he considers himself.
That's great.
we're having a little conversation, and this woman comes out and she went, "It was really rude of you to interrupt the service that way." And I just turned, I thought, a little like you're interrupting this conversation.
That's
And
funny. Yeah.
she started unloading on him, and she almost turned to me to say, like, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I don't think we should judge immediately." She went, "No, I'm not judging. I'm not judging, but it was really rude."
Yeah.
Okay. And a couple others came out with a similar sentiment. Then, lastly, the priest who came out, that seemed like he got it. He came out with like a spring on his step, a smile on his face, and one of them said, "We're really sorry. We weren't trying to create a big, like we weren't really wanting that reaction." And he just turned around and he said, "Hey, what would Jesus do? Actually, what did Jesus do?" And he said, "Listen, you've got my email. Send me email. I'd love to talk to you more about it. Have a wonderful day." And he just walked off.
Yeah. There you go. That's beautiful. Yeah.
And I just kind of
Great
felt
story.
it. I felt at the time, like when he was talking, it was like, oh, he got it. Then when he came out and how he interacted with them, I was like, oh, he does get
Really
it.
did. Oh, I love that. That's great, and that's refreshing too, to see like a religious leader that does get it and does walk the walk. Yeah. I mean, Jesus famously says, "Love your enemies," right? Pray for those who persecute you, and we're not doing that now in 2023, let alone in the Iron Age. When there's blades and cutting arms off and heads off all the time, to say love your enemies. I mean, it's radical. It's a radical teaching. And I think there's a great book actually by Leo Tolstoy, of all people, decent writer, who wrote a book called "The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You," referencing Luke 17:21. It was his kind of nonfiction, one of his few nonfiction books, series of essays about Christianity and about the issues with the church. He actually calls a Christian military an oxymoron, which is a great comment, because it is. I mean, Jesus says, "Turn the other cheek." This isn't. It doesn't mean being a doormat, right? Because when you're standing in a place of unconditional love, you're invincible. Actually, you have this level of kind of invulnerability, and acceptance. Like to your story of like appreciating these people versus judging those people, and like getting upset. I mean, I think Christians, just to like play devil's advocate here, to defend the Christians, to say they are going for their own needs to their Sunday spiritual community, and so like a disruption there could be intimately personal, right? And so that's going to ruffle feathers, and so I do understand that. I try to empathize with everyone as much as I can, but at the same time, Jesus, really one of the most profound things, not even just of his life, but I think in the history of humanity, is Jesus being killed. And he says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." I mean, that is Christ consciousness. People say, what's Christ consciousness? Christ consciousness is you're being murdered brutally, humiliated, and you say, they don't get it. It's okay. I mean, that's, almost nobody has been on that level, if anyone, right? So I really honor that, and I honor your question. WWJD. Did you guys have that movement, WWJD, in England, like we had in America? People used to wear bracelets that said WWJD. It was like in the 90s and 2000s. It was a really like funny little like churchy moment in America. And this guy I got coffee with this Christian guy, and he was wearing his WWJD, and we were talking about my book, and I was like, "By the way, love your bracelet." And he didn't. He probably didn't expect the author of Original Sin is a Lie to say that, but to me, that's the move. It's like to really ask that question, like, what would Jesus really do? How would he act? That's the spiritual path to me.
Yeah, absolutely. What would, if you were in a place of Christ consciousness, like what would you do? And that
See the
what you,
oneness of all beings.
and what you said about forgive them for they know not what they do. I reference it all the time, and I think actually that also includes forgiveness for ourselves as well, for
Yeah,
because we all slip into unconsciousness,
absolutely.
and I feel like that's really what he's pointing at is the unconsciousness that we can all operate in, where we aren't conscious of the oneness of the truth of what we are and sometimes what we're doing. Um, yeah, I love it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think relating kind of that teaching to the Eastern mystics and Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, you know, people say, "Well, original sin is a lie." Well, have you met another person? They're not great. you know, we're we're inherently. The message of original sin is a lie just says you are inherently good, right? Original sin is a lie sounds so edgy and stuff, and I'm not as crazy about the title, even though it's my title, just because it has that triggering aspect, which is not necessarily my intention, but it really just means your inherent goodness. And then some people go, I don't think so. People are pretty awful, And the way the Hindus say and the Buddhists say is we're just ignorant of our true nature. That's all. It doesn't mean we're dirty. It just means we're ignorant temporarily of who we truly are. And to kind of the earlier point of like the mystics are just remembering, we're just undoing that little me, that needs, that wants, that judges. We're just undoing that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that because the next question I was about to ask you was what made you come up with the title for the book, Original Sin is a Lie? And I was going to ask for the listeners, what does that mean to you? But I guess you just answered it.
Well, also it's a great example because not only is it our inherent goodness or evil is the mystics, consider us inherently good versus kind of the institution. And the institution creates that guilt in order for kind of a power play. If you go to Wikipedia and look at original sin, you will see that it is a concept created by Augustine of Hippo. And that's how the book starts. My book begins with the paragraph is like 300 years after the death of Jesus, two monks were arguing. And Augustine said we're originally dirty, sinful, and Pelagius said we're originally neutral. It was just an argument between two guys. And Augustine was more powerful politically. He had greater savviness, and he became a saint. And Pelagius was exiled and excommunicated. And it's a nice little kernel of a story of like how this works in religion. It's very human, it's very political. And Jesus himself never says we're inherently dirty. Augustine is reading some Paul, and he's reading some from Genesis to make that interpretation. But Jesus himself never says that. And Paul never knew Jesus personally. So that kind of disqualifies, it definitely puts Paul under Jesus to me, in terms of like, who am I really trying to interpret? Paul has some nice things, um, but he's a complicated figure. And he's not the Avatar of Galilee. That's who I want to know. What's the Avatar's teaching? So that's original sin is a lie. But yeah, then it gets into, it's not just, a friend of mine read the book and he said I thought it was going to be just 300 pages of you talking about that doctrine. I'm so glad it wasn't. It's like that's just like the first chapter, and then the other 19 chapters are about world mysticism and kind of spiritual philosophy, psychedelia, Hindu and Buddhist thought, etc. So it opens up from there. It's not just about this weird red
Sure.
letter of our soul.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what I find interesting as well is actually, from my understanding, the etymology of sin meaning to miss the mark,
Correct.
which
It's a lot gentler.
has a really different connotation around it to say like
Yeah.
rather than like you sinner, it's like that was a sin, which means if I was to say, hey
Just
brother,
aim better.
You missed the mark there. Try again.
Right, exactly. It's much gentler. Yeah, it's hamartia. It's the original word, and it's an archery term.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, wild. What was your kind of journey to getting to the point of writing this book? Because it's really, from what I've heard so far, it really is very rich in not only a broad but clearly a very deep and intimate understanding of philosophy and religion as a broad spectrum.
Oh, thank you, Sabri. I was kind of always that like little kid reading spiritual books. My mom told this story that she said when all the other kids were reading Harry Potter, I was reading Thich Nhat Hanh. and that's true. I read Living Buddha, Living Christ as a young kid, and I write about this moment in East Texas. I'm in Austin, Texas now, which is very progressive. It's where I kind of went to middle school and high school, but I was a little kid in East Texas, which is very Christian and very fundamentalist. And my own experience, I went to East, I was an Easter Christmas Christian, so it was very, I enjoyed going actually. We had a real deal pastor who was really charismatic and genuine and warm, and he was great. And we went twice a year, so it was like I enjoyed. It was fun. We got dressed up, sang some songs, but then I, what happens when you're a little kid, as you probably recall, is when you sleep over on Saturday night, you got to go with your friend's family on Sunday morning to their church. And so I did that with my friend who's a Baptist, and it was very different. It was very fire and brimstone. And this little old lady, this is seen in the book, this little old lady came up to me and said, kind of had like a little pamphlet. It was almost like contractual, if you will. She said, "Do you want to go to heaven?" And I was like, I think so. It seems better than the alternative. And she goes, "All you have to do is say Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior, and sign here on the dotted line," type of energy. And I was like 8 or 9 years old, and I was like, "This is very bizarre. That it seems like there's more effort required, basically." And so, that kind of started it for me. My dad also was altar boy Catholic to angry atheist to spiritual. He met a woman that really helped him appreciate spirituality and had a lot of mystical experiences. And so I kind of grew up with that fatherly influence of like an open-minded spiritual dad. And then he met this Apache teacher. It's kind of like the third thing I'll say about. I was about 10 or 11, and it was. I write about it in the book. I'll just tease it, but Richard is a very profound spirit. He's an energy healer. He grew up on the reservation in America, in New Mexico, and he's connected. He's doing work. He's very busy. He's helping. He's healing people right now. He doesn't have a website. Doesn't have an Instagram. He's the real deal. He just kind of follows the spirit, and I've been lucky enough to kind of get some mentorship from him, and he's just kind of points me along the way. We connect now every year or two, but it just kind of, I've always had this appreciation for mystical reads and the depths across spirituality. I got a bunch of books over here, and I think I've just, in my own personal experience, I'd say the last 10-15 years, after religious studies school, I've really just trying to undo, just consciously trying to undo judgment, consciously trying to undo very little steps. I'm not awakened, I'm not enlightened, I'm not a guru of any kind, but I'm just polishing the mirror. We're all just polishing the mirror. We're all just undoing it. And it seems like it's working. I do feel like I'm, more peaceful than ever. I do feel like, really I'd say my kind of theme of it all is love. I think like being compassionate to ourselves, being compassionate to others, trying to empathize with everyone. It works. It definitely works. I still get upset. I got angry the other day, but that I'm still embarrassed about. But it's a, what is it? The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, baby. Just one after the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just your recognition of I got angry the other day and I'm still embarrassed about it. But that actually says a lot because it's you recognizing as you becoming conscious of that unconscious moment. And
Yeah,
it's yeah, we're also human, right? We
yeah,
also have these human moments. Within our humanity, we have these moments.
totally. Yeah, and gentleness with self. A Course in Miracles, that I mentioned a few times. A Course in Miracles, very deep Advaita Vedanta. They say very similar stuff, and A Course has just been very profound in terms of its almost emphasis on forgiveness. So this is the last chapter of my book talking about. I come back to forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do, and really like if the idea in A Course is if you hold a grievance, you're just handcuffing yourself. That's all, and if that's to yourself or anyone else. And so it's almost like too, Sabri. I mean, if I say that, it's like I'm not even judging the judgers, or I'm trying not to. My goal is not to judge the judgers because I think I see this in spirituality too a lot, which is like, oh, those religious people, oh, those churchy people that judge people. Well, that you're right, but you you just did it. You're just judging them, And the
Yeah,
whole point is, and I'm not judging you for saying that, as best I can. I'm just pointing it out
observing.
and
Yeah,
observing it. Maybe there's a difference between judgment and discernment, or observation, but the goal is just there's this beautiful image from Maharaji Neem Karoli Baba who says everything's working out perfectly. Everything's just unfolding exactly as it should. It's like as soon as there's any kind of pushing or pulling or resistance, you're not letting people find their own discovery. It's not, you can't impose it on anyone else. And that's all we're all trying to do all the time. Saying, well, you need to see it like this. And it's like the only person you can change is yourself. The only person you can really affect positively is yourself. And then if whoever's around you is open to it, then you can, impact them in a positive way. But you can't, that's something that I've learned in my 30s, not in my 20s.
yeah, I am fully with you, man. And you know what? I think doing it in your 30s actually is probably pretty early for for a lot of people. And yeah, I'm 35, and
Same.
yeah,
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 baby. 88. Let's
88,
go.
yeah. And I did a little post earlier this year about this, like um the moment you resist where someone else is on their path, you're resisting your own path.
Mm,
And
love it.
to think they shouldn't be where they are, you've actually fallen off your own path. And and it's so easy to do. Just a couple of weeks ago, I almost had to take a week out to because something was bothering me so much, and I was like, I just know this is so out of alignment, and isn't this isn't I. This is me. This is the little
Mm.
me. This isn't the I, and I felt so out
Oh,
of it.
that's step one.
And I did like I took a small amount of cannabis and did like a parts integration journey that was like an hour long. That was really profound. But I always had to take then a week out of to really go into this is bothering me so much. I know this isn't right. And
Mm.
I came out the other side feeling the deepest gratitude for what was happening because I felt like it allowed me to break through to maybe like another layer or level of realizing, you know, a pattern that I was in that maybe I hadn't fully witnessed before. And But yeah, I think especially when you're on this path, sometimes we can judge ourselves extra hard
Yeah.
when we do have those moments. But for me, it was like it was a really triggered thing, and I was like, okay, this is wild. I've not felt like that for a long time. I was like, I need to go into, where is this coming from?
That's great. That's really fantastic. And I honor your understanding and level of awareness as well. I've appreciated your questions and your insights, and you're very on the path, and what I found kind of in relation to what you're saying about noticing that is it seems like before I make a jump, the ego gets scared and it turns up the heat. It's almost like, it's almost like a 2 to 4 year cycle for me. It's like, wait a second, why am I? Who I thought I was done with this, but it's like it's because it's almost the death of that chapter. But the ego goes, no, no, no. Like, are you really? It's flailing on the way down. It's trying to grab the gargoyle foot and the ledge, and just saying, no, you're going to be judgmental. Here's a perfect scene in your life that's going to test where you're at. And a course talks a lot about there's a finite number of lessons, but a seemingly infinite amount of manifestations of that lesson until you get it. And so it's like there is an enlightenment, there is an atonement, there is a awakening of that all beings will undo and see the oneness of all creation. But within linear time, there's all these dimensions, all these timelines. Within the dream, there's all these complexities that are beyond analytical comprehension, right? So it's just undoing this one, and then I'll undo the next one. Be gentle with myself or where I am.
Yeah, so true, brother, so true. And thank you, for the feedback you gave me then. What I'd really love to do, honoring your time is, we can wrap this up today. But I would love, once I've finished the book, if we could do this again. I've really enjoyed it, and I just think I can sense there's so much depth of knowledge and understanding that you have to share, that I think the listeners will really appreciate and value this. And two things: one, where can people find you? And two, where can people get the book? And again, I will say, although I'm only a third of the way into it, immediately I just feel like it's one of those that I will absolutely either gift or recommend to people. And truthfully, not saying that, before now, someone asked me last week, what 3 books would you recommend? And actually I just said, A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. Do it 3 times.
That's great.
And
I love that.
I've listened to that 12 times. 12 times I've listened to that. But very honestly,
he hits the hype. I mean, he's worth the adoration.
Yeah. But very honestly, so far into the book, I genuinely feel there's the same kind of value in the clarity on what I'm hearing from this. So recommend it to people. But yeah, where can they find you? Where can they find the book?
Thanks, my brother. Yeah, I think especially it sounds like it's resonating for people that grew up Christian and have had difficulties reconciling appreciating Jesus, but not really understanding kind of churchianity, as Yogananda calls it. It seems like it's really helping kind of former Christians almost kind of full circle, not necessarily come back to church, but say, oh, wait, I had to go into Buddhism or I went into yoga, a lot of people, but then they go, I read your book, and now I'm like, oh, okay, I get why Jesus is great and integrated. So it's like, that's in some way I've become like this Jesus defender, which is so bizarre. Anyway, it's been a real interesting ride, and I would love to come back and talk when you're finished. The website's originalsinisalie.com. That has kind of all my stuff. And yeah, I'm mostly active on TikTok and Instagram. They're both at Original Sin is a Lie. And it's not just me talking about the concept from Augustine. I talk about a lot of stuff, but yeah, thanks so much, Sabri, and hope your audience enjoyed.
Thanks so much, brother. Thank you so much for being here, for watching. If you want to find Bob, the links are going to be in the description below. His website is originalsinisalie.com, and it's the same handle on Instagram and TikTok. And lastly, if you enjoyed this episode and you haven't yet, please subscribe and leave a comment. All right, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you on the next one.